This series is made possible by the generous donation of Stifel Financial and viewers like you. Thank you.
My name is Rich Adams. I'm with the California State Parks, and I'm the Sierra District Forester. And the Sierra District covers a large area, 6 counties. Nevada County is one of them. I'm stationed up at Lake Tahoe at Sugar Pine Point State Park, and that's our district office, our district headquarters. And I cover 17 state parks. About half of those are in the Tahoe Basin. And then I go north up to Plumas County and south to Alpine and Mono County, Mono Lake. And then also down here to western Nevada County. Here we have Empire Mine, South Yuba River, and Malakoff Diggins. And then also in Nevada County, Donner Memorial State Park, which is in both Placer County and Nevada County. So I'm the district forester. I'm a California licensed forester, and I'm also a prescribed fire burn boss, and I'm a prescribed fire manager. So I'm managing our prescribed fire program on the district and making decisions on where to implement burns and when. And I have a staff of about 16 people in the summer for about 8.5 months, so an extended season. And most of them are on a crew, a fuels crew, so they're doing forestry work, implementing the forestry program that we run. So in the summertime, they're doing fuel reduction, running chainsaws, cutting trees, feeding the chipper, stacking burn piles. And in the wet season, we're burning piles. And then in the shoulder season is our prescribed fire season. So we're actually putting fire on the ground and implementing understory burns in the forest. Most of that's in the fall, but we do a little bit in the spring as well. And this time of year, we're waiting for the snow to melt up high so that we can start opening facilities. We're going to be opening the campgrounds for Memorial Day weekend. And there's always a lot of cleanup, in the winter, from the winter time, trees that have fallen or branches or pine needles and storm damage. And right now we're dealing with a lot of hazardous trees, trees that have died as a result of the drought. Even though the drought is over, there are still delayed effects of the drought, bark beetle activity and tree mortality. And so we've had a lot of hazardous trees that we've been cleaning up in our developed areas. I know we have a big workload ahead of us. This was a particularly big winter, and there's still a huge snowpack, and we're waiting to get in and clean up these areas so that we can open on time. So we have a long-standing prescribed fire program on California State Parks since 1973, and on the Sierra District since the early 80s. And typically we do our burns in the fall because that's the time when the weather is getting cooler and wetter. It's a safer time than in the middle of the summer. Also, it is a less sensitive time for wildlife than the spring. Spring is nesting season and baby season, so the baby squirrels can't necessarily run away like they can in the fall. We do surveys for nesting birds and for denning or habitating species ahead of time, but fall is definitely a less sensitive time and more representative of the pre-settlement fire regime. There probably weren't a lot of fires in the wet spring, but certainly fires used to burn all summer long and into the fall and into the winter months. And so one of the goals of the prescribed fire program is to mimic the natural function of fires and to restore some of that natural process. There's only so much we can do. We're really burning only very small areas, but that's one of the goals, is restoring the natural function of fire on the landscape. Someday we may be able to do prescribed burning during the summer, but we need a much safer landscape to be able to do that. If we've burned an area 3 times, maybe on the 4th time we could burn that in the middle of the summer. But right now we have such a huge fuel loading out there, and areas next to the burn, we don't want those areas to burn, and so typically we wait for some rain in the fall, but certainly higher humidities and cooler temperatures until we're in our prescription. Less than 10%. It's a really small area in comparison to our ownership. But we pick those areas strategically, either near fire roads or near areas that we want to protect, because we can reduce fuels and provide some protection, or in areas that we want to restore, areas that maybe used to burn frequently but don't burn frequently at all anymore, where we want to restore that process. And it's really a long-term investment. So these areas that we pick for prescribed burning, it's not a one-time treatment. It really is a forever management scenario. And so now we're looking at reburning areas that we burned 10 or 20 years ago to maintain those previous investments. The state park ownerships are thousands of acres, and our burn plots are small in size. The smallest actually has been 1 acre, a 1 acre burn plot. Last year we burned some 20 to 30 acre plots next to each other. So we had a continuous area of about 54 acres where we burned over the course of a couple days. So relatively small comparing to the park, but 54 acres along the highway in the natural preserve, strategically placed, and it was a reburn of some burns that we did in the 90s. So on these areas, we are seeing some great success. Yeah, roadsides are really important, both the public paved access roads and then also the interior park fire roads. These are areas where first responders can come in and respond to an incident, either fight a fire or rescue people in danger. And those are escape routes. And then the road itself is a fire break, and so potentially the road is where a wildfire could be held along the edge of the road rather than jumping across the road. So roads absolutely are important for hazardous fuel reduction and safety, fire safety. We're definitely looking at all of our roads and prioritizing based on proximity to other resources and values at risk, and looking at escape routes, safety zones. There are a lot of factors going into this. Also currently areas of tree mortality. We're jumping around chasing these areas of dead trees because those become the most important for public safety. In planning prescribed fire plots, we'll look at our existing infrastructure like roads and trails, and then also natural features like rivers and meadows and rock areas, and we'll try to incorporate those as logical boundaries of prescribed fire units to minimize the amount of line construction, because ultimately we have to have line around these burn plots, and so if the line can be between a trail and a road, that can minimize the amount of line construction. We make information available at our visitor center and our entrance stations. We hand out some fire safety materials. In the Tahoe Basin, we have the Living with Fire publication, and also at our weekend campfire programs. Some of those campfire programs are catered towards our program of forestry and fuel reduction and prescribed fire and some fire safety. So there is some outreach to the campers and to the visitors. Yeah, volunteers are a great asset for the state parks, and so one of the ways the volunteers can connect is through the Park Champions program. And also at the local park, there are volunteer opportunities. It's not so much with hazardous fuel reduction like running chainsaws, but definitely with pulling weeds, which a lot of the weeds that we have are highly flammable. And there is some help that we need in the springtime with opening facilities and trails and raking up the facilities areas and raking up pine needles. I mean, that's a huge help for sure. So yeah, there are volunteer opportunities. Beyond that, I would say tie in at the local park. I mean, just checking in at the visitor center or at the entrance station, you can ask for information specific to that park. Of course, with volunteers, we definitely want to guide them in the right direction, show them this is the native plant and this is the noxious weed, and certainly there's a lot of energy, but it needs to be channeled in the right direction. So we have an internal document that we share with our cooperators, and that's a wildfire management plan for each park unit. And so that describes the park, and it's really catered towards the incoming first responders who maybe aren't familiar with the park. So the values that we need to protect and the special features like power lines or mines or toxic soils left from mining, and also where the visitors are probably going to be, and where the evacuation routes are, and where there are opportunities for fire suppression, such as the roads or natural features, natural barriers. So the wildfire management plan, that's really an internal and an agency document. And we meet with the local cooperators, the local fire chiefs, and we'll collaborate on, any current events or current activities. From the fire safety perspective, I would advise all of our visitors and really all of our neighbors to be aware of the weather conditions. And the National Weather Service does release a fire weather watch or a red flag warning. And those are really important to pay attention to. It's an indicator of critical fire weather conditions like dry, windy conditions, not necessarily high heat, but could include high heat. But when it's dry and windy, we all need to be extra careful and extra vigilant and watch out for each other. And in busy areas, there are going to be a lot of crowds, and if we get into an evacuation situation, the evacuation route could be overwhelmed. And so especially watching out for those red flag warnings and having a plan ahead of time. How am I going to get to a safe area? On a red flag warning day, the conditions could be where if there's an ignition, the fire is just going to get away. The fire's going to run. And so, on a day that's not a red flag warning, firefighters have a better chance of getting on top of that start. Initial attack is more likely to be successful. Really, any time of the day, whether it's nighttime or morning, the red flag conditions are a big watch out. Most of the fires burning on a state park are fires coming into the park from outside. And that's what we've seen recently in Northern California and Southern California. Like last year, Malibu Canyon, a lot of state park property on several state parks burned, and those fires came into the park from the outside. Or locally here at Empire Mine, we've had fires coming into the park that ignited outside. And so an ignition could come from anywhere, But that's been the typical case lately, is fires coming into the park from the outside. We do have campfires in our developed campgrounds, but the developed campground has these large metal fire rings and paved parking, and everything's raked, and there's typically a camp host in every loop, and the rangers are patrolling. And really, when the campground is full, it becomes its own community, and everyone's really watching out for each other. And although there are sources of ignition, that's not typically where the wildfire comes from. So, as a licensed forester, I do have some of that perspective, although I work for the public agency. Years ago, I did some private consulting and given homeowners some advice. And so really the job of a forester is to ask the landowner, what do you want? What are your objectives? And then the forester implements those objectives or provides recommendations, how to manage the land for the multiple benefits that you want. And so, if you live on this property and you have forest, you want an area that's nice to live in, and you probably want a reasonable amount of safety. That's a big topic, is fire safety. And maybe you want some habitat for the wildlife that you like to see. You like to see the birds every morning. And so balancing all these different things. Maybe you have some special features that you want to protect or manage for. And so balancing all those things. And that's really the role of the California licensed forester. So I am a licensed forester. So I recommend, seeking some advice on those things. But I would start with looking at the existing trees that you have on your property and which ones are really the most important to you. Do you have certain special trees that, oh my gosh, I just can't lose this pine tree out in my front yard. It's just the most wonderful tree that I have. And so then that becomes a really high priority. You may want to give that tree more growing space so that it has more water, more sunlight, and also reduce fuel that could carry fire up into the canopy of that tree. So small vegetation under the canopy could act as a fuel ladder and carry surface fire up into the upper canopy. So when I'm training someone on how to mark trees for my thinning project, what I'll tell them to do is not look first for the trees that you want to mark. It's look first for the trees that you want to keep. And imagine the future forest and the forest 50 years from now. And so those trees that you really want to keep, those might be ones that you want to thin around and give more space. We have challenges with bark beetle. Bark beetle are native. They've always been here and they always will be here. They play a natural role in killing the weakened trees. But during a drought, sometimes all the trees are weakened. And that's where we can see a bark beetle outbreak, where the bark beetle are killing groups of healthy trees, which is difficult to see and then difficult to deal with. But what we want to do is give the trees more space, more water, more sunlight, more vigor to better fight off the bark beetle. And so general tree vigor helps, and it can then give the tree more sap, more resin, and can actually drown the beetle by pushing the beetle out. A bark beetle flies, lands on a susceptible host, and then bores a hole in through the bark to get to the phloem, which is the layer between the bark and the wood. The phloem is all the sugars from photosynthesis going down to feed the roots. So to a bark beetle, the phloem is the stuff. I mean, that's what they want. But if they get in and then lots of sap pushes them out, sometimes you can actually find a dead bark beetle drowned in sap on the outside of a tree, and that's where the tree won in that case. But when there are too many beetles and not enough water, the beetles end up overtaking. And the way they end up killing the tree is by girdling it. So they'll bore these galleries in the phloem and all the way around the tree, and it cuts off the phloem from feeding the roots. The roots die, and then the whole tree dies. So you can look for signs of bark beetle on the outside of the tree. You can look for what they call pitch tubes, and the tube is where the beetle went in, but you see the pitch coming out. And if it's real sappy and real runny, that's a good sign. That means the tree has a lot of water. But if it's real grainy and it has like wood dust in it, then that means the beetle has been feeding successfully. If you have a healthy tree that doesn't have bark beetle in it yet, but you know you have bark beetle nearby, and so this is like a dangerous year because you know they're in the area, you can call a tree service company and have your one special tree sprayed. And the spray doesn't kill the beetle, but it prevents new beetles from coming in. Because beetles are guided by scent, and they like the scent of that next host tree. And so that spray can repel new attack. But once your tree is infested and the beetle are in there, it's almost impossible to get rid of them. There may be a way to have your tree injected, but I don't see that working very well. So really, if you have a few pine trees and one of them is infested, at that point you want to get rid of that material because the beetle are going to reproduce and then spread to the next tree. So you really want to minimize your loss and get rid of that infested material. Another thing that can be a problem for bark beetle activity is creating fresh green slash material in the spring. Because right now in the spring, as the temperatures warm up, the beetle become active again. They've been overwintering in the tree, just waiting for the next warm season. And if you have fresh green pine slash, they're going to be attracted to that. They're going to get into it and reproduce, and you may be creating your own pine beetle problem. Spring can be a dangerous time as far as if you leave a whole bunch of green material out there, particularly green logs and green limbs. You know, if you can do some tree work right now, but you really need to clean it all up. If you cut a bunch of green material and you leave it all lay, that's going to attract bark beetle in the warming spring months. Certainly fuel reduction in strategic locations like along roads and around facilities can make us safer if we don't have an extreme weather event. I mean, in an extreme weather event, it's hard to say what's going to happen. But on your average day that's not a red flag day, if you've done fuel reduction, then a wildfire should burn with less intensity. There should be lower flame lengths, more opportunity for firefighters to engage in firefighting, to set up their engine, actually get out of the engine and engage in firefighting. Fuel reduction alone on a wind event day is not gonna save everybody. There are a lot of things that we need to do, you know, including home hardening, better construction materials, defensible space, and you know, the whole suite of things. And even all of that, if there's an extreme wind event and the fuels are dry, it's going to be a very challenging situation no matter what. In areas where we decide to do management because of values at risk and all these other factors, we decide to reduce the fuel loading and thin the forest and reduce the ladder fuels and hope that we're going to have low flame lengths. Another factor is how long has it been since it last burned? And so imagine if I'm the reporter and I'm saying, this area behind me just burned a week ago in a wildfire, and the last time it burned was over 100 years ago. And I mean, just imagine what we're looking at. Or if I said, and the area behind me was burned in a prescribed fire 5 years ago. I mean, I would expect that there would be some kind of difference there based on that it had burned just 5 years ago. And so that's where prescribed fire can really help us out, is kind of completing the cycle of the fuel reduction. You know, we can do the thinning and we can do the fuel reduction, but if we burn it, oh my gosh, well, we just burned it. And so I can tell you it's not going to burn again tomorrow, you know, if I just burned it. And over time, it gradually accumulates fuels again. But that's getting into that, you know, restoring the fire cycle. An area that just burned last year, I mean, you could throw road flares in there next year, and you're just not going to get it to go like you would if it had been 100 years since the last fire. Yeah, so the logging story is really the history of California. I mean, you look at the forest that we have now, and probably it was logged. I mean, there are very few areas that were never logged at all, and so maybe it was logged a few times in the 1800s and then a few times in the 1900s. And it's just part of the story of the development of that stand. The state parks, we are using some logging tools, particularly in areas of heavy tree mortality in our developed areas. When all the big trees die around the camping area, yeah, we end up logging because we're just overwhelmed by all these trees that are threatening now. And so logging is one of the tools, and it's one of the critical tools, really. I mean, we can't just leave all these dead trees around the facility area. So we are using logging as a tool. I would say if you're going to do logging and one of your objectives is hazardous fuel reduction and fire safety, then the most important step is following through with the cleanup and cleaning up that slash material and any type of vegetative material that can carry high flame lengths. That really needs to be managed as part of the cleanup. So I think we need to do some improvement on the concept of evacuation route capacity. You know, these highways that we have, can they hold the volume of people that might be evacuating? It's just a scary situation, but something that we have to look at more carefully. You know, where are the safety zones? Where is a temporary refuge? So maybe you can't get people all the way over here, but can you get people to a temporary refuge? And maybe we can plan some more temporary refuge areas, a hardened large building with a large parking lot where you know you can get people in and at least keep them safe for a certain amount of time, you know, a 12-hour, a 24-hour period, some sort of length of time where people could have a temporary refuge. That's something that we need to improve upon. We are looking at our existing infrastructure and how to make that existing infrastructure more safe, like where we have a large parking lot already, but maybe there's a lot of dense vegetation right around that parking lot. You know, how can we reduce the fuels right around that parking lot and make it safer so that if a fire is approaching, maybe it will drop down from the crowns and just be a surface fire, because a surface fire would be much safer than a crown fire near that parking lot area. And parking lots can also be staging areas for incoming first responders. You know, we might stage fire engines and crews, and so we want that parking lot to be safe for them as well. A crown fire is a type of fire behavior where the fire is actually carrying through the upper canopy, and it can be in combination with a surface fire, or sometimes is independent of the surface fire, where it's truly just carrying through the canopy. If the canopy bulk density and the volume of vegetative material is so great, and the wind is blowing and the fuels are dry, the fire can carry through the crowns as a crown fire. Right now, we think we're experiencing climate change. It's been measured that maybe we're just a little bit warmer, 1 degree or 2 degrees warmer. And so, you might think, well, how does that affect, on the day of a wildfire, if it's 82 degrees instead of 80 degrees, either the air temperature or the temperature of the fuel, if it's just a couple degrees warmer, are you really going to see any difference in the fire? And where the effect is in the seasonal drying. And so, every night here in the West, here in California, it gets cooler at night and the humidity tends to come up a little bit. And let's say in the morning, you get up early to mow your lawn and it didn't rain, but the lawn is a little bit wet. Well, there's some dew. And that morning dew happens when the temperature lowers and the humidity comes up and you reach the dew point. And so over the course of the summer, if you have less days with morning dew, you're actually drying the fuels out on those nights. And that is something that's happening now. Now we're getting more nighttime drying than, say, 10 years ago. And we're experiencing fire behavior at night similar to fire behavior during the day. And this is a really scary situation, that the fuels are drier. So through the course of the summer, fuels are drier than they used to be. It's not necessarily that it's 82 degrees instead of 80 degrees. It's that fuel load is drier and more ready to burn.